In this video, I want to discuss why it's important to work on the preliminary study before starting on the bigger painting. I will explain all the things I figure out in a sketch before I start on a larger painting. This is the reference photo I found online, this beautiful peonies, pretty complex form, so definitely creating a sketch first will help me not to mess up my painting, especially since I want to paint it on a fairly large format on good quality watercolor paper. For my sketch, I will be using, of course, much more economical paper option. I'm using Hippie Crafter's watercolor paper. It's 50% cotton and it costs about half as much as heavyweight pure cotton papers, but the quality of this paper is such that I can use the same techniques as I will be using in the final painting, and the results will not be drastically different. So I will be able to test all I need to test in my sketch on this more economical paper. What exactly do I need to resolve during the sketching process? Of course, the first thing will be to test the color palette. I have used this color palette before, but it never hurts to test it once again and to see how the colors will need to be distributed. So that's what I'm doing right now. I didn't do a preliminary drawing. I'm kind of drawing with my brush, and I am following the reference photo closely, just basically copying what I see in the reference photo to see if this composition is going to work. So this will be the second thing I'm trying to resolve, is the composition of my future painting. As I work on the sketch, it occurs to me that at one time I decided that when painting light objects, it's better to start on the background than on the object itself. And in the sketch, I jumped in and started painting flowers. So now there is a chance of overworking the background because I will want to achieve really good contrast with the flowers, and the flowers are already there. I should have painted the background first and let it dry to see how dark it will be, and then just add just the right tonal value on the flowers to show those delicate shadows and variations in petal colors that I see in the reference photo. This will be another decision that working on the sketch first allowed me to make, is to start with the background and not jump in and start painting the flowers, because that throws off my tonal perception, the perception of value. As my sketch progresses, I noticed that painting those 4 flowers was a bad idea. For some reason, it's always better to have 3 objects or odd number of objects as the focal point. So that 4th flower, I thought I could push it to the back a little bit, but in my sketch, it's just too prominent and there's no movement. The composition looks too static and basically kind of boring square. So definitely need to stick to 3 main flowers. Another thing I want to test in my sketch is how to paint the shadows. I'm going to use watercolor brush pens. They're also by Hippie Crafter. They're very convenient for sketching. They're much faster and a lot easier to use than watercolor on a brush. So I'm going to try and paint shadows with them. I'm considering using them for the main painting as well. But as I work on the sketch, I realize that the edges that they produce are just way too hard for the shadows. So it will be very important for me when I work on the larger painting to have soft shadows, because these look just way too prominent and there is no way to soften them. These brush pens are staining, so I can lift some color, but still the edge remains. So this tells me that the shadows need to be soft, and also the color needs to be a lot more neutral than what I'm getting from this brush pens, so they won't work, unfortunately. So here is my sketch. I made some important decisions while I was working on it, and I think I'm ready to paint the peonies. I'm working on a half sheet of cold press 300-pound watercolor paper. The brand is Kilimanjaro. Because the paper is so heavy, I don't have to pin it. I am just going to give it a wash of clean water. Make it easier for me to create the soft background. I'm going to start with the background as I decided. I'm going to use my ceramic cups and squeeze some fresh paint. I have Cascade Green, I have Sap Green, and I have Lemon Yellow. A large painting requires a lot of paint, and the wells on my regular palette are just way too small to give me sufficient amount of pigment. I want really saturated brush strokes from the beginning. I don't want to have to apply 15 layers of paint to get the saturation that I want. So I'm going to start with barely diluted fresh pigment and with a large flat brush that holds just a little bit of water and a lot of pigment. I'm drawing with the brush and I'm finding the outlines of those 3 peonies that will be the focal point of my painting. Peonies are my favorite flowers. I love all flowers, but peonies, especially in my home country in Russia, they bloom in May when I have my birthday, and I used to always get them for my birthday, and just they smell absolutely divine. So they're not only pretty, they also have beautiful aroma. So I love painting them, and hopefully this painting will turn out the way I wanted it to be. You can let me know in comments what you think about the final result when you see it at the end of this video in just a few minutes. So for the background of this painting, I am not going to worry about painting each leaf. I'm just throwing in different shades of green, some mixed with yellow, some without, because I want this background to be very abstract and very loosely painted. I might be adding some details later. We will see. We will have to think about it and decide when the painting has progressed a little bit further. I'm going to squeeze out some more paint. This is my opera pink, which I will be using on the flowers. I think I need to throw in some on the background to hint at some distant flowers. I decided not to include any more flowers in the focal point, but I think I can hint at them in the distance. It will be okay. So I'm adding a little bit of opera pink, mixing it into the colors that I already have in the background. When opera pink mixes with cascade green, it gives really nice purple color, which looks good. It creates kind of like a shadow between the leaves. And I think I need some of phthalo blue. Not a lot, it's very intense color, so I can use it directly from the wells. That will be sufficient. I need to start adding dark shadows in the background. Like I said, I want it to be intense, very saturated, and to create good contrast with my flowers, so the flowers will really pop off the page. We cannot create contrast if everything is the same tone, if everything is light, so we need some dark passages to make the light passages stand out and really sing. If you're interested in loose style watercolor painting for florals, I have a whole collection of videos on my channel. Some fall leaves that I painted, also some lilacs. I have a big sunflower, so I will leave you all the links in the description so you can check them out as well and see some other tips and pieces of advice that I included in those videos as well on loose watercolor painting. Alright, I made the first pass at the background. I went and changed my water because I had so much green pigment in it, and I'm going to start working on the flowers. Like I said, mixing opera pink with cascade green gives me a nice neutralized pink, kind of lilac color, which I think will work for shadows on the flowers. First thing I'm going to do is paint the large forms. I'm going to define the shadow sides on those flowers. If we try to simplify them as a form, they're basically spheres. So there will be a light side and a shadow side, and I need to find all those shadows. I think it's one of very common mistakes, and I made it 1,000 times myself. When painting complex forms like that, we think we need to paint each petal, and the more precisely we paint all these petals, the better the painting will look. But I just find that very often this approach makes the painting just way overworked. There's just too much information and way too many mistakes, and very often kind of fluffy, poofy flowers like this, like peonies, roses, start looking like cabbages instead of flowers. So we need to remember to approach these forms like we usually do in painting, from overall to details, and to add those details gradually and stop as soon as we see that there's enough information on the page for people to understand what we're painting. Not an easy judgment to make, but with experience it becomes easier and easier to know when to stop. I'm allowing the color from the background to seep into some areas on my flowers. Like I said, the form is spherical, so I need the bottom to turn under and kind of turn away from us, and I can achieve that by making the edges there softer. I want a hard edge between the light side of the flower and the background, but the shadow side of the flower and the background, there can be a soft edge between them. I'm also verifying the outlines of the flowers at the same time. I didn't draw anything, so I need to kind of draw with my brush so I can go around and find a little more precision. I mixed some very deep purple from phthalo blue and magenta permanent, and I'm going to paint the darkest shadows on the background. I'm trying to broaden my tonal range. I want to deepen the shadows around the flowers to make them stand out more. I'm using a smaller brush. This is Asian art brush with a really pointy tip. Gives me good control, holds a lot of paint and water, and gives me a good variety in my brush strokes. And you can see once I started deepening those shadows, the flowers stand out a little more. They kind of start separating from the background. So that happens when we broaden that tonal range, that range between light and shadow. Let's work on those distant flowers as well. We want to have a little hint that something is going on there. And this will be my first layer. I need to let everything dry and evaluate the result and see what else I need to do to bring this painting to successful completion. All those deep dark shadows that I painted around the flowers, of course, lightened quite a bit. That's the nature of watercolor. So I'm going to use my 3/8 of an inch dagger brush and add more pigment in those areas. I want to give even more precision to the edges of the flowers. Still just drawing with a brush. Like I said, I did not do a preliminary drawing. I'm just looking at the reference photo and trying to replicate it to some extent. The reason I didn't draw anything is I could have drawn the outline, probably it would be okay. But I find, first of all, making a drawing for loose painting can be a little restricting. And also it's hard to get rid of the pencil lines when you paint something light like this. Somehow they always end up in the wrong place and they end up under those light washes, and once you put down a wash of watercolor you can't erase the pencil. You can erase them on white paper, but not after you apply the watercolor wash. It's much better to just draw with a brush as you go. Maybe I'll use my little mop brush as well. I want to soften those shadows in some areas, kind of bring them into the flowers. Use the same pigment but in very diluted form to paint shadows on the flowers. I will try to keep the edges in those shadows soft, as I decided when I was doing my initial sketch, and I will also try to keep those shadows neutral and transparent. So remember, I tried using the brush pens, but they were just way too intense and the color was way too saturated. It needs to be neutralized for shadows to work. So this will be a little bit slower stage because I will be adding details, but I don't want to add too many details. I want to keep my painting loose. So I will be stopping from time to time and evaluating the results because, like I said, I don't want my peonies to turn into cabbages, to look too tight and too detailed. I want them to remain soft and loosely painted, and for that I need to add just the right amount of details for them to look like peonies, but at the same time not to be overworked. I will be working on the flowers themselves, and also I will be working on the background at the same time, building the tonal range, building those tonal relationships between the background and the focal point of the painting. To speed up a little bit this section of the video. I think you understand what I'm trying to achieve here. You saw me paint the first flower. The other two I'm doing pretty much the same thing, adding just the right amount of details to make them more realistic. It's very important to have enough saturation and enough depth in the centers of the flowers, because if you look closely, they're pretty intense in color, and there is also a lot of shadows in the centers where they have the stamen, or that area is protected by the petals. Petals cast a lot of shadow on it. To make the flower more three-dimensional, it's important to have intense centers, maybe even more intense than you see in the reference photo. And another thing that's very important is, like I said, have soft shadows. So after I apply all those details in some areas, I have to go over them. You see me using a flat brush, and I'm unifying the shadows. If I have too many details, I smooth them over and try to get rid of them. I use the same approach for the background, for the leaves, because they're further away from us. We want some details, but not too many. And if too many details appear, we can always unify them, connect those dark shapes, or maybe lift paint in some areas, or just use some clean water and apply a wash on top. All this kind of dancing around, all this balancing of everything, that's what creates a successful painting. So it's not a straightforward process or a formula. It's kind of a balancing act, and we have to constantly look and evaluate the result. I know some beginner artists are really intimidated working on a large sheet of paper. They think they will not be able to handle it. But I think at a certain point of your art practice, you have to at least try larger format. I would say now it's harder for me to work on small format because you have to work so precisely, and larger format seems a little bit easier. I can really see what I'm doing. I can see all the details, and I can see the texture of watercolor that's on the small format that's hard to show because there's just no room. So if you're not an absolute beginner but a little bit further down your watercolor journey, I encourage you to try larger format and not to be intimidated by it. You have to have, of course, the right size brushes for that. If you only have like a tiny little brush, it will be very hard, of course, to work on a large format. The paint keeps drying and lightening, and I keep darkening the shadows around the flowers. You see they stand out now even better. Cannot do those very dark shadows on large areas, that will look too dry, but small areas work really well, and I want to concentrate them around the flowers to bring them out more as my focal point. Alright, my next step will be to bring back the whites and to find the highlights. I have Dr. P.H. Martin's pen white opaque ink. I'm applying it with a small calligraphy brush. I'm squinting when looking at my reference photo. I lost a bunch of whites with all this loose painting, so I want to bring them back. Again, it's important not to overdo it, not to apply those whites absolutely everywhere, but to find just a few places in the focal point to restore the whites and add even more contrast to my painting. Let's add some whites maybe on the background as well. I see the light is hitting some of those distant flowers. I might have to soften the edges because I don't want them to push forward too much, but I do want to have something there for visual interest, and I also want to connect them to my main composition so they're not just floating in space, but they're kind of grounded in something. I can even restore some white of the paper in the corners. I always go overboard with the background, it seems like, but white ink works really well with watercolor, especially on large format like this, because it kind of soaks into the paper fibers and it becomes invisible. It looks very natural. I use white gouache a lot, but that looks different because gouache sits on top of the paper and you can really see the brush strokes. So I think ink in this case will work a lot better. I am going to soften the edges, kind of mix in that ink with watercolor, and I can even tint it with watercolor and go over it with a little watercolor wash if I want to soften some places. It's really versatile material. You see, I even get a little bit wet on wet effect when I apply pink watercolor to a wet ink wash. It starts to float and I really get nice soft edges and very natural effect. So those distant buds were a little muddy. I mixed in a little too much green there, but using white ink allows me to get them to the point where they need to be. I'm still not happy with the background. I like that it creates a lot of contrast, but I just feel it's too monotonous. Maybe I need some lighter elements in it, but I'm not sure. So what I'm going to do is go back to my sketch, and before I do something on my large painting that I spent several hours working on, I don't want to mess it up, so I'm going to try adding lighter leaves to my sketch and see what it's going to look like. Yeah, I think it really balances the composition, adds visual interest. So that should work. Let's do this on the larger painting. Some clean white ink. It really thickens, so it's a little hard to get out of the bottle. I need to mix it really. And I am going to mix in some yellow, some New Gamboge directly into the ink to get that light yellow that I tested on the sketch. I am going to use it for the painting using my calligraphy brush. And again, it's important, you see I wiped that first leaf. It's important not to be too precious about it. We still need to look very loosely with kind of bold, almost calligraphic brush strokes to be decisive, because our brush strokes immediately tell the viewers if we were confident or we were hesitating. So I'm going to be confident and apply just a few of those lighter leaves in some places. You don't really see them that much in the reference. I'm kind of inventing things, but what I'm doing here, I'm trying to connect the focal point to the edges of the painting and to those distant buds that I painted with some lighter passages, because everything was kind of separate and the focal point was just hanging in the center of the painting. But now the elements of the painting are more connected. So that's the logic behind adding those lighter leaves and even maybe some grasses. Something can look like some grass or something like that, branches maybe. So I'm going to add all those lighter elements, and they will darken a little bit after they dry. They will seep into the paper. All right, I think my painting is finished. Let me know in comments what you think about the process and about the final result. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching it and for giving me your feedback. Don't forget to check out the other links in the video description, and I'll see you in the next video here on Tamara Studios channel. Help other artists to see this video by liking or sharing it. To see future videos, subscribe and click the bell button to be notified when they're published. Thanks again and stay creative!